Welcome to PHP 101. In this video, we're going to cover what is PHP. To do that, let's start in the browser and talk about the concept of how code is interpreted. That is, the code that you as a developer write is then rendered to create the display that you see in your browser. So if we go to Google here and we right click on this and view page source, you're going to see the source code is really just a bunch of code here that for most people is probably pretty difficult to read. But it's this code that creates the page, and it's the browser in particular that looks at this code and then renders it into the display that you see over here. So your browser really, at its core, is just an interpreter. It interprets the code into visual display. Now, with PHP, there's certain types of code or languages that are processed what's called client side, and there's some that are processed that are called server side. Now, HTML code, which you may be familiar with, JavaScript, CSS, those are all processed client side, which means by the browser. However, PHP is something that's processed server side. So we're going to take a look at my fancy drawing skills here, and I'm going to show you what that means. So if we were to draw a line down the middle of this page here, and we were to say this is the client side and this is the server side, as I mentioned, your browser would sit over here, and then your server, which is really just a computer that's configured in a certain way to serve web pages, would sit over here. As I mentioned, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, these all are over here, whereas PHP and MySQL are over here. And really what PHP and MySQL are is they're just software that's installed on this server. So in fact, there's three kind of key pieces of software that are often installed on a web server to make it work. That's Apache, PHP, and MySQL, or some sort of database software that interacts with PHP. Now, this is what's called a LAMP stack, assuming that this is running Linux, because it stands for Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. Now, again, these are really just pieces of software that are designed to allow this computer to serve web pages to a browser. So what happens is when you go to google.com, that actually gets translated into what's called an IP address. So your browser makes a request for google.com. It gets translated into a IP address by what's called a domain name server. And then the browser gets that IP address and makes a connection with that particular computer. So every web server out there, every computer connected to the internet has an IP address, and browsers connect to these servers directly to transfer information back and forth, which is the web pages that you see. So when that happens, the program that handles those requests is Apache. So Apache initially receives the request from the browser, and the browser will often tell it what it wants. So if you go to google.com, then that's actually a web page typically called index.php or index.html. Could be default. Or if you go to, say, the about page, it could be about.php. So the browser tells Apache what it's requesting from it. And so then Apache looks in its file system. So it has a file system just like you have on your computer. And it says, okay, it wants index.php. So I'm going to grab that file. But I know that it's .php. So that means there's the potential for PHP code in this file. So that means I need to send it to the PHP processing engine to see if it needs any of that code processed. So that's what Apache does. It sends it over to PHP and says, hey, is there any PHP code in here? If there is, then PHP renders that code, and if necessary, it will make any request to MySQL that it needs to make. And then once PHP is all done, it sends that file back to Apache completely interpreted. So Once it sends it back to Apache, there's no more PHP code in it. That PHP code has been processed to create whatever it's designed to create. So oftentimes it's HTML, could be CSS, could be JavaScript. Whatever it's asked to create by the PHP code that you write, that is all interpreted before it sends it back to Apache. And then Apache sends it back to the browser, where it's then interpreted by the browser because it's HTML, CSS, JavaScript, etc. So PHP is what's called a preprocessor. It's something that processes on the server side before it sends it back to MySQL. Now, this is somewhat important to understand because it gives you an idea of what it is that you're actually doing when you're writing PHP code. What you're doing is you're almost always you're writing PHP code that's then going to write out or output some sort of HTML or CSS or JavaScript. So you're using PHP code to write other code, and that's how we make the interactivity of a web page. So if we go over here back to Google, when we type in a search here, what's actually happening is there's a request made to that site to perform this search, and that's being processed. It's being sent to Apache. Then, when we hit the submit button, that's sending that, that request is being made to Apache. Apache is sending it to PHP. PHP is querying MySQL, and then it's getting information back that just shows these results here. And then it sends that, PHP says it's done. It sends that back to Apache, and Apache sends it to your browser here. Now, I don't actually know if Google runs on PHP and MySQL. So for all the purists out there, this is merely just as an example of what's happening. But that's really what PHP does. And what it allows you to do is it lets you add conditional logic, lets you interact with databases, process HTTP requests, and do a whole lot more that you can't do with just static HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So PHP is a preprocessor that allows you to add an element of interactivity, make your web pages dynamic, and really make robust applications that actually do something as opposed to just display information.